or flight response. With continued exposure to stress, the hormonal system kicks in at first with activation of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, in short, HPA axis, which releases the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then stimulates release of cortisol from the adrenal gland. The involvement of the immune system is somewhat complicated, but believed to also lead to the activation of HPA axis. And cortisol is a main factor in the stress regulation systems, and it may play a role in the persistence of pain as well. And cortisol is a catabolic hormone released from the adrenal cortex. Its serum concentration is usually peaked in the morning to facilitate arousal. Throughout the day, it functions to maintain blood glucose level for vital organs such as brain and the neuromuscular system, and it suppresses other non-vital organs to promote energy storage. It also exerts a potent anti-inflammatory effect and also has immunosuppressant effect. The corticosteroid is the same class of catabolic hormone as a cortisol, so it's easier to understand cortisol function and potential adverse effect if you compare it to the corticosteroids. Cortisol is also known as a stress hormone because its serum concentration level surges in response to a stressor to provide energy to cope with the stress-induced stimuli or to escape from the danger. Although a short-term surge in a cortisol level is an adaptive response, a prolonged cortisol activation may cause a number of unwanted effects such as muscle or bone breakdown, fatigue, depression, and memory impairments. A prolonged cortisol activation eventually leads to cortisol dysfunction, which leads to unmodulated inflammatory response. A mechanism by which cortisol dysfunction develops is unknown at this time, but it is probably akin to how type 2 diabetes develops. So this diagram was taken from Hannibal and Bishop, and it nicely illustrates how cortisol dysfunction develops and its consequence. Cortisol dysfunction leads to unmodulated inflammatory response, prolonged pain, and emotional distress, such as depression, which in turn becomes a stressor itself, perpetuating this vicious cycle. Also important to keep in mind is that this process occurs not only with a physical injury or physical stressors, but also with psychological stressors. So an individual who suffers from psychosocial stressors might have already developed the cortisol dysfunction. When that person sustains an injury, or his or her recovery may get complicated because of a cortisol dysfunction. This is called priming, and this is things to watch out for. A question is then, how does OMPT affect stress regulation system? This is a recent scoping review on this topic, and there is a preliminary evidence that OMPT, especially spinal manipulative techniques, has an influence on the cortisol regulation, but its effect on the clinical outcome remains to be seen. Now we talk about pain perception. So let's recap what pain really is. According to Dr. Melzer, the pain is a danger signal, and it always has a context and a meaning. For example, a little cut in a finger means so much more for the pianist than, say, for a soccer player. A context in which an injury is experienced also has a significant impact on the appraisal of the injury. For example, impact of the same finger injury to the pianist could have very different meaning if the injury occurred a day before a concert. Pain always evokes feeling and beliefs because they affect the appraisal of the danger signal. It could include fear, anxiety, feeling of uncertainty or helplessness, but it could also be self-empowerment, bravery, or fearlessness. And the pain always leads to the behavior as it is required for the protection from the further harm or injury. Fight or flight is a good example of a behavioral response to pain or threatening experience. Pain appraisal is a cognitive function, but highly influenced by emotional states. The cortical structures shown in the slides are consistently identified in patients with pain-related emotional and psychological distress, such as pain-related fear, pain catastrophizing, grief, and depression and anxiety. Also, cognitive impairments such as impaired executive functions and impaired short and long-term memory have been shown in patients with chronic pain. A recent comprehensive review reported that the most significant changes in the brain functions occurs in the cognitive and affective network in the patient with chronic musculoskeletal pain. And the sensory network has been shown to remain relatively stable even in a patient who developed persistent pain. So these brain regions are also highly involved in adult learning process. Now, if you recall, one of the additional notes that accompany the pain definition states that through their life experience, individuals learn a concept of pain. So the key concept here is that the learning is a powerful process for pain experience, and a maladaptive learning is likely involved in the persistence of pain or pain-related disabilities. The fear avoidance model, excuse me, the fear avoidance model was originally introduced by Blaine and Linton in 2000 as a framework to explain the transition from acute to chronic pain. And it's now considered leading model for understanding disabilities associated with chronic pain. The model is based on classical conditioning, which is a form of associative learning. Classical conditioning is also called Pavlov's conditioning and named after the famous dog used in an experiment. There has been a substantial increase in the research in the field of pain-related to fear and disability since this model was proposed. This figure is an updated fear avoidance model. Now, pain is the most common experience in response to an injury. For those with no fear, they confront with pain or actively cope with the injury and progress to recovery. For those who have catastrophizing belief about pain, eventually develops pain-related fear. Pain catastrophizing may be influenced by feeling of uncertainty or unpredictability, or may also be influenced by threatening information learned through social media, friends, and family members, or worse, through healthcare professionals. Now, once fear sets in, the classical conditioning leads to avoidance of activity that was associated with a pain experience. And fear avoidance or hypervigilance leads to disuse, depletion, and disability, especially withdrawal from the previously valued activities. The cycle then continues and the fear avoidance behavior gets reinforced as the process repeats itself. A recent systematic review provides robust evidence to support the fear avoidance predict transition to chronic pain. Jay et al. Also conducted a prospective study including over 8,000 Danish office workers who were followed for 2 years. And this study provided strong evidence that among workers with very high fear avoidance, there was a 48% higher risk of long-term sickness absence. But there was no significant difference in other groups with low to moderate fear avoidance. So this quote is something I like to emphasize out of all this presentation. The fear of pain is worse than the pain itself. If you haven't realized this, you may not be asking the patient the right questions. For example, if you ask, why he or she stopped certain type of activities, first the response is probably because of pain. Now, if you stop there, you're not really getting into another layer of this question. For example, a lot of time, I would ask the follow-up question. So when was the last time you tried to do that activity? And oftentimes patients say, well, I really never tried, so I don't know. Then I ask, so what's the reason that you haven't tried? And it usually comes to, well, because I'm worried that it might hurt or I might injure either knee or shoulder. And if you really ask the right questions, it usually follows the path that a patient is so fearful of picking up activities that they previously enjoyed. So again, this is about deeper questioning that may require, but please keep this in mind. Oftentimes, when the patients suffer from such pain-related disabilities, it is usually from the fear, not a pain itself. So, does OMPT helps for the fear or any type of fear measures? So this is a fairly recent systematic reviews. Again, the conclusion was that OMPT has no clinically meaningful effect on the fear measures, whether that's a fear avoidance, kinesiophobia. Even though this is a systematic reviews, the number of studies they put is fairly low. And also, this is something that I'd like to get back and talk about a little bit later on, because I think they're one of the, if you use OMPT in a more neuroscience way, I think this is one of the primary effect the OMPT can have. That's actually to ease the fear on movement. But anyway, I'll get back to it. But this what this evidence suggests is, and a traditional OMPT may not have any effect on any of the fear measures. So the last thing is an action program. So pain experience always leads to the selection of the behavior or an action to protect or escape from further harm or threat. And an action can be voluntary or involuntary. Choosing not to act is one type of behavior selection. Just as I discussed in the previous section, and there's an adaptive actions or maladaptive actions, which is often observed in patients with chronic pain. And when we talk about action program, we are mainly talking about motor and sensory cortex. So these brain regions works in concert through feedback loops for the accurate execution of actions chosen. It is more meaningful to think of the two regions as a one network, and it is often called sensory motor cortex. And sensory motor incongruence refers to a mismatch between motor intention and a sensory feedback. And the concept was originally proposed by Harris in 1999. And the clinical signs and symptoms associated with sensory motor incongruence includes altered perception of shape and size of painful limb, phantom swelling, that is a sensation of a swollen limb or body part without actual swelling, and a force exertion disproportionate to a task. In general, individuals with pain tends to exert more force than necessary for even a simple daily task. And this trend becomes more prevalent in people with persistent pain. And the question is, does sensory motor incongruence lead to chronic pain, or is it a consequence of chronic pain? And available evidence seems to suggest that sensory motor incongruence is a consequence of chronic pain state. But whatever it is, whether it is a cause or consequence of chronic pain, this sensory motor impairment is common and needs a specific approach to address it. Now, systematic review by de Gossens et al. Provides robust evidence on a sensory motor impairments in patients with low back pain. And the impairments have been shown to associate with the function of brain changes in the sensory motor networks. And a more recent systematic review by de Christ et al. Found an associations between selective psychological distress and altered spinal movement patterns, more significantly reduced spinal movements and larger muscle activation patterns. And these changes are believed to lead to maladaptive movement patterns, also called movement impairments. The movement impairment was first proposed by O'Sullivan et al. And they theorized that for some patients, acute pain episode leads to an exaggerated muscle co-contraction, commonly seen as muscle girding. And due to a combination of exaggerated withdrawal reflex and a movement-related maladaptive relief, the muscle girding eventually leads to maladaptive movement patterns, which is a sign of overprotection to minimize the movement. The increased muscle co-contractions, even during a simple ADL task such as bending forward to pick up an object from the floor or getting up from the chair, causes abnormal tissue loading, leading to chronic pain state. If the maladaptive movement pattern is repeated, it eventually leads to neuroplastic changes in the sensory motor cortex, further reinforcing impaired movement patterns. Then the vicious cycle ensues. The sensory motor exercise is a new approach for the movement impairments, and this type of exercise is focused on improving abnormal movement pattern by gradually exposing the patient to feared movements. So this type of exercise is unique in that it has nothing to do with strengthening, stabilization, or stretching, but rather focus is on correcting abnormal movement pattern itself. A recent system review